So thank you all very much for coming, and we are really delighted to welcome everyone here to Gallery Photography Ireland for this special In Conversation talk this evening with Martin Parr and Fintan O'Toole. It has been a particular pleasure to reopen the gallery after COVID with Martin's fantastic exhibition. It is truly loved by all our visitors, and we're delighted that Martin and Fintan can join us this evening. The event is part of our programming around Martin's exhibition. It's such a kind of, it's got such breadth, this particular exhibition. It tracks Ireland's cultural transformation over the last 40 years, from fair days and mass going to the first glimpses of prosperity and the building of bungalows and the McDonald's drive-ins, right up to modern day Ireland of gay marriages and Dublin's tech explosion. And as it really covers everything from the Pope to a flat white, as the accompanying book so pithily puts it. So Martin himself was directly involved in the selection of the work for this exhibition. It was printed at the Martin Parr Foundation in Bristol, and the show was produced by Tracy Marshall Grant, who's the director of the Bristol Photo Festival. And we'd very much like to thank Tracy and the team at the Martin Parr Foundation for all their work. It really has been a delight to work with you. We'd also like to thank the touring partners at Limerick City Gallery, where this show premiered, and at Roscommon Arts Centre, where it will have its next incarnation in their fabulous new gallery space. It will also tour to the Macmullen Art Gallery in Boston, the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris, and come back home then to the Belfast Exposed Gallery. As ever, we'd like to thank our funders, the Arts Council and Dublin City Council, without whom we couldn't do all the fantastic things that we do. And finally, we also want to acknowledge the gallery's frontline staff, Dara, Dan, and team. They've really kept Martin's exhibition open during these very difficult times. It is a wonderful exhibition. I do urge you to visit. It is free to visit. No appointment is necessary. And it's on show until Saturday, the 4th of September. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Trish Lamb, who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Tanya, and welcome, Martin and Fintan. Martin Parr is one of the most well-known photographers working today. As many of you will know, he's a close and ongoing connection with Ireland. He and his wife Susie moved to Roscommon in 1919 and lived there for a couple of years. Martin has influenced generations of Irish photographers. In the 1990s, he led the wonderful masterclass workshops organised by Christine Redmond, former director on the Aran Islands. He's had several exhibitions here in gallery photography. We've counted at least 4 times across the decades. Through his own photobooks and his work in showcasing the art of the photobook, he's been enormously influential. And Martin's connection with photographers in Ireland continues through his role as visiting professor at Ulster University. As an artist, curator, collector, tastemaker and influencer, Martin's contribution to the development of photographic practices internationally is immense. What might be less well known though, and something that we've noticed consistently, is his championing of photographers and his quiet generosity to other artists and organisations such as ourselves here in Gallery Photography. So we'd like to say thank you, Martin, for that. Fintan O'Toole is joining us tonight from the States. You're very welcome, Fintan. Fintan, as you know, is a leading photojournalist, literary and drama critic, historical writer, political commentator and broadcaster, amongst other things. Fintan writes beautifully and insightfully on photography, as evidenced by the text in Martin's Fair Day and the recent From the Pope to a Flat White book. He has featured work by contemporary photographers on a number of the covers of his books, and he's a generous supporter of artists and broader cultural activity. We've had the pleasure of having Fintan launch exhibitions here in gallery photography down through the years, and he's all been really generous with his time. So we're really delighted to welcome him back here virtually this evening. Just to let you know, this event is being live streamed on YouTube and it's also being recorded. So if you don't want to be part of this recording, you can watch it on YouTube. We are taking questions. They're in the chat down below. So if you'd like to put in any questions as we go along or at the end, we'll take them after the in-conversation. So finally, thank you, Martin and Fintan, for joining us virtually here this evening. And over to you, Fintan.
Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be here with Martin, in particular, an artist whom I've admired so profoundly really since I met him really in the early 1980s, and we worked together. When I say we worked together, I was privileged enough to be able to write the text for A Fair Day, that wonderful. Martin's first book of photographs from Ireland, which I think has stood the test of time, is really kind of remarkable for its artistic quality, but also as a social record. So I think Martin is just going to take us through some of the photographs. We're going to talk about them as we go along.
I'm going to go through some of the pictures and we'll break out into discussion when appropriate. So I can't remember, Fintan, this book came out in 1982. What were you actually doing in the early 80s that made me bump into you? Were you working for In Dublin, or?
I was, yes, so I was writing for In Dublin magazine. I was the drama critic there. And you probably forget this, but I wrote a piece about a country and western star presenter on RTE radio called Pascal Mooney, which is about the country and western world, and I was just kind of trying to get some sense of all that strange kind of cultural phenomenon. And I think you really liked that, and you thought I might be an appropriate person to write the text.
Great. And here, of course, is a new book, and as Tanya and Trish have explained, it is actually called From the Pope to a Flat White. And the first serious event that I really photographed in Ireland was the 79 visit of the Pope. And I was living in the UK at that point because I didn't move to Ireland until 1980. Perhaps, Fintan, it'd be good for you to sort of try and explain the significance of this visit by the Pope in terms of the social context of the late 70s in Ireland.
So I suppose, the context really was one of kind of incremental cultural and social change, which had been happening really since the late 1950s, gradually through the 60s and 70s. I suppose it was, broadly speaking, a kind of process of opening up, of secularization, urbanization, all those kind of things that have happened everywhere else, but happened very late in Ireland. And you had a lot of worry then on the part of the Catholic Church, which was the power in the land, was beginning to worry that maybe things were going to go too far. And they brought out their nuclear weapon, really, which was Pope John Paul II, whom people may remember was not just Pope and carried all the kind of charisma of the office, but was also an incredibly charismatic figure himself. He was a real star. No Pope had ever visited Ireland. They hadn't needed to. Well, they wouldn't have been allowed to do so, of course, for significant parts of Irish history when you had the Protestant ascendancy. But it wouldn't have been necessary, after the Irish state was set up, because Ireland was the most securely Catholic country probably in the world. But it was thought that this was the time for it to happen. And what Martin's photographs capture so magnificently, I think, is the sense of expectation, the sense of joy. It's hard to get your head around the fact that the event, the first big mass that he did, was in the Phoenix Park in Dublin, and there was over 1 million, probably 1.5 million people at it, in a society that had 3 million people. I've read, I can't document it for certain, but that mass was the biggest outdoor crowd assembled in Europe since the Second World War. It just gives you a sense of how absolutely huge this event was. And of course, there were every single one of the other masses, which Martin's photographs also document, like in Knock and in Drogheda and Galway, were attended by vast numbers of people. And the interesting thing for me was looking back on these photographs and looking back on that event, was at the time it seemed overwhelming. If you were like me, you were kind of secular liberal, it seemed like this is the steamroller, the future is going to be the same as the past. It was a way of kind of putting a full stop to Irish developments. But actually what's really fascinating is if you look at the Pope's sermons, they're full of gloom and doom and foreboding and fear. They're all about warning that the devil has his eyes on Ireland, and if the devil gets hold of Ireland, what a great prize this will be for Satan, And they're actually very pessimistic, and yet so the audience is full of this kind of joy and expectation, and the Pope himself was full of this kind of anxiety and gloom. Do we want to have a look at some of the other?
Yes. So here we are. This is in Phoenix Park in Dublin, and then. In the book, we've got a sort of few general sections. This, of course, is in O'Connell Bridge in Dublin. This is when I was also working on a project called Bad Weather. And I started Bad Weather as a project in England because we're obsessed with the weather over here, as you are indeed in Ireland. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to do a book around a national obsession. And so I continued shooting my bad weather pictures when I came to Ireland. It just happens, I like the idea of this woman walking with a box on her head. And now we get to the sort of more traditional. So in this book, the original book, I think there's something like 5 chapters, and this is called The Remaining Fairs. This is Malm Cross, which is in Connemara, and it's a sort of crossroads where people would meet for a horse fair. I think it was in autumn, sort of October, November, and this is a regular haunt for the Irish photographers. It's interesting to think that the Irish photographers, of which I was one, we all had a little circuit that we went on. And these were sort of Crowpatrick, Spanshill Hill Horse Fair, Malm Cross. And in one sense, I sort of joined in this because, of course, they're very good photographic opportunities. But at the same time, it makes you realize that Ireland is being represented in a sort of very cliched way by Irish photographers and indeed, in my case, English photographers. But who can resist the sort of beautiful scenes that you get in these events? So part of my thinking in this, in doing the work when I was living in Ireland, was to try and get away from that. But at the same time, I was sort of attracted to it. So it's a sort of repulsion and an attraction at the same time. And of course, you can never ignore the huge religious influence. And this is a very small well in County Leitrim in Killorgan. And I like the fact that this well is being attended by 3 or 4 people. Unlike, say, Crowpatrick, which will have 50, 100,000 people climbing up in the last Sunday of July, whenever it is. So this is just one that I found out about in the local paper. So when I was living in the west of Ireland, every Thursday and Friday, I would get the Sligo Champion, the Leitrim Observer, all these local papers and go through them looking for events to go to.
Well, what I love about this photograph in particular is that particularly because of the beautiful black and white and the starkness of it, it could be 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. It's actually very hard to locate time within it until you spot the plastic cup. So that, like, the plastic cup tells you, oh no, it's not. Like it's well, it was what was then now. It was early 1980s Ireland. But I think it's fascinating what you're saying, Martin, about this attraction to and repulsion by the sort of traditional images of Ireland, because of course the reality was that they still existed. I mean, these were not being performed for photographers, or for tourists or for outsiders. There was still an unconscious kind of life to all of these events, to the horse fairs. I mean, horse fairs existed because people bought and sold horses. I mean, they were working environments for the people who were there, and these religious practices, which in many ways still continue. Let's remember, they haven't, it hasn't completely gone, but they were of very profound significance to the people who were taking part in them. I mean, these places, these holy wells, you can sort of see it on the face of the woman who's bringing her child. People brought their kids to these wells if they had an illness or if there was something wrong with them, or they expected some kind of outcome. And I think what the photographs get is the sort of layers of this Ireland. It's not a simplistic view of it, because you know, it has these layers, it has this kind of modernity, it has all this striving, all this kind of consumerism going on, but underneath it, there are these kind of sediments of something that's almost pre-Christian, of course, like I say with this well, you have the Blessed Virgin Mary, but the well itself could well, you know, possibly go back as a water spirit thousands of years.
And this is another location on the photographic circuit. This is Puck Fair in Kilorgan in County Kerry, which is a must attend. And on the first day of Puck Fair, you're able to sell your cattle in the street, special dispensation. And of course, the characters that you get at these events are tremendous. You couldn't invent them better. And this is Glenby, the picture on the front cover of the fair day. This is a horse race on the beach in county, is it county, I think it county, not sure which county it's in, Glenby.
I think it's in Kerry as well, is it?
Kerry, yeah, it makes sense, yeah. And one of the highlights of looking through the paper was finding small local farm auctions, which I would go and attend. And this is a classic case of such an auction. And of course, you know, most of the people come just to sort of make it a social event. I love this sort of the back, you know, the back wall there of those guys looking in, and the auctioneer doing his best. It's probably all done digitally now.
You know, it's again, it's hard to remember, but this was still a cattle economy in rural Ireland. You know, it still had that sort of pre-modern sense to it, because there's a good chance that the cows being sold here, you know, would be shipped off live to England. You know, that was one of the main mainstays of the economy still. You know, it was live cattle exports. I mean, they still go on. You know, but I was an urban kid. You know, I grew up in Dublin, but we would wake up quite frequently, you know, in our you know, working class suburban house, and there'd be cattle in the back garden, you know, because they would have been being driven through the city, you know, towards the port, and they'd wander off, you know. So it was still a place in which you could not be unconscious of the fact that you know, it was dominated by agriculture, and agriculture was dominated by this almost kind of cowboy-like trade, which leads us on to the next photograph very nicely.
So in my attempt to sort of get out of the horse fair rut, if you like, one of the subjects I landed on was looking at these new bungalows. You may remember there was a book called Bungalow Bliss, which had its sort of probably heyday in the 70s and the 80s. And you would buy this book and you then order the bungalow on page 78 and have this built by your local builder. But here someone is trying to outstrip the local competition. I think this is just outside Westport or in County Mayo, I'm not sure. But this is one of the chapters that got Fintan very excited, I seem to remember, because it gave him a chance to write about this sort of new idea of how Ireland was potentially changing. Fintan, I leave it up to you to take up the thread here.
Yeah, you know, I mean, these things, they're kind of absurd and ridiculous, but you have a real sense of this sort of cultural moment, you know, which is where people are trying to be modern, but they want to be modern in their own way. And the big thing is you get, particularly in the Irish countryside, you know, you get country and Western music takes over really, really enormously. And this imagery of the Wild West, you know, it's like it's an American modernity, very much is really what people are interested in, and it's the way they want to identify themselves, you know, and it comes in a way from this kind of cattle culture, you know. It's not that far away from Texas, you know, in some ways, and this was a period in which, you know, there's a lot of money going into the countryside because Ireland had joined the European Union in 1973. The big argument in 1973, you know, if you look back on it, was all about, you know, agricultural incomes. That was the big thing. You know, what people in the cities were going to do or think or feel or experience was not really the issue. It was, will farm prices rise? You know, and yes, they'll double. You know, was the promise. They didn't quite double, but they did rise pretty fast because you had EU prices suddenly, and so it was a bit of a boom. You know, and people spent the money on demolishing or at least vacating the old thatched cottages and building their own, well, bungalows or sort of country and western mansions like this one if they could afford it. And they're sort of poignant, because they're like very uncertain about what is this place. That these things didn't really make any sense in this landscape. But at the same time, they're also kind of statements of a certain kind of confidence. So they're uncertain about where we are and how we belong and how we express ourselves. But they're also saying we're going to be here. And you can't emphasize enough how much of a change that is, because the previous generations emigrated. They would have gone to America, and now they're bringing America to themselves.
Here's a good example of the house being upgraded from the dirty, old, smelly thatch to the modern bungalow. And this is something else that I got very excited about, which is the country and western dances, the dance halls. This, I think, is from the Mayflower in, is it Ballahadreen? No, not Ballahadreen. Bannister. No, sorry, I can't remember where it is. Does anyone know?
It's in Roscommon,
County Leitrim.
Leitrim.
Shambo. There you go.
Yeah.
And this is taken on a tripod. And of course, as you all know, these would be visited around midnight when the pub's shut. There wouldn't be alcohol served in these ballrooms, and you'd have a good dance. And I assume now that all these ballrooms have now disappeared. Would that be right? Does anyone know?
They're all gone, yeah. They were a huge phenomenon, which mostly, some of them started in the 1930s because Fianna Fáil and the Catholic Church, since Fianna Fáil came to power, the Catholic Church, they banned dances in people's houses, which is where people used to have dances, or outdoors in the summer, the famous dancing at the crossroads stuff. And they insisted that they be licensed, which was a way of controlling them. The church was worried about the rampant sexuality that might happen out of their purview, So the dance halls, of course, also made a lot of money for local bigwigs. But by the 1960s, early 1970s, it was a huge boom. There were enormous numbers of them built throughout the country, and as you can see, they were packed on certainly Friday, Saturday nights, really, really jammed. Sometimes thousands of people going to them. The Irish show band circuit was as lucrative as the rock and roll circuit was in England. There was a lot of money going around. I love this photograph. I think this is one of your great photographs because of the ghostliness, the strangeness of the figures gathering under the lights and going in. It has a kind of odd, sort of almost gothic kind of feel to it, doesn't it? It feels like something that's, I suppose it was very dark and very late, which
so that's why you've got that movement.
Yeah, but it captures something very, very, very haunting about it, because it's more haunting now than it was at the time, because these are disappeared places. These are not, so some of them might be still physically.
When do you think they shut down? In the 80s or 90s?
Yeah, very much in the 90s, the early 90s. The sort of social life moved on. I think even in the 80s, the people were beginning to move to lounge bars. Smaller scale stuff. People liked drinking and dancing. And as you say, one of the things you couldn't do in the ballrooms was you couldn't drink and dance at the same time. Of course, fellas used to have, this is where the hip flask and the naggin, the little bottle of whiskey or vodka, whatever, was very important. Guys would go into the toilets, of course, to drink. But I think as people got more civilized, they thought, actually, why can't I drink and dance at the same time? So it certainly began to change. And also people didn't really want that kind of being herded together. I mean, they were extraordinary places. I think I went to this place with you, Martin, and I mean, they were so regimented because you had all the girls sitting behind a barrier, and the boys walking around as if the boys were the cattle. It was very like a cattle market in reverse. And then the boys would sort of go behind the barrier and sort of kick a girl on the ankle and say, didn't even say anything, just kind of, you dancing maybe, or, maybe one sentence would be exchanged. I attempted to get somebody to dance with me, and I was looked at like I was the most appalling. The fella from Dublin, certainly couldn't get any.
No, they dance in sets. You have 3 or 4 songs in one set, and then you change your partner for the new set.
Yeah.
And here we are at the Mineral Bar. And here we are in the toilets. No drink. I can't see any drink there, but got to get the hair right. And here's a young man being rejected, it looks like to me.
It might even be me. That's certainly what happened to me anyway. I don't think it's literally me, but I remember that expression that's on the girl's face.
That's it. They used to stand up on the stool, on the sort of benches around the edge.
Yeah.
It's indeed a bit like a cattle show, as you say. They're a bit older.
That's the older people, yeah, who are, I suppose, theoretically there to supervise, but aren't really bothering.
This is down in Dingle. This is the Dingle races. That's one of my favourite bandstands, or racing stands. I don't know if it's still standing. I can't imagine it is.
I'm sure health and safety has interfered.
This is an abandoned house.
It's a wonderfully haunting image, and you could see these, you could at pretty much any part of the countryside, you'd be wandering along and you'd see these abandoned cottages. You could look in, and what was always so poignant was the human traces still there. It's not like they were just empty. They had these, like the cups, the bread bin, the teapot. I remember seeing one house like with the table was still set, and they felt as if people had as if it was like Pompeii or something, just some disaster had happened and people had just disappeared. But of course it was mass emigration, and this is the single biggest shaping force in this society, was mass emigration. Just people left, and they left initially, of course, for England and America and Australia, and then also from the 60s on, as Dublin was expanding, people are going to Dublin as well. So yeah, you this kind of very, very haunting sense of this landscape and these abandoned lives within it.
This is in I think it's Ballinar. No, not Ballinar. I can't remember where this is. It's another horse fair. So as well as the horse fairs, of course, you had the general fair days where people bring in their veg and their cows, the odd cow. These, of course, I would always go to. My job was to try and find people, because I like photographing people. So any event would be an excuse for me to take my camera and go along to it. So just to explain, my wife, Susie, had set up this speech therapy service in County Leitrim, and I had the car to drive around. Well, we had two cars because we had to, and I was there. I couldn't really survive as a photographer, so I just went out and took my own pictures, and I would just go, to different events, try and go do something every day if something was on. This is in Westport, County Mayo, and here I suppose you see the sort of American influence coming in.
I remember going inside in this place, it had the stars and stripes up, it had a big American flag and the flag of New Mexico, just to make sure it was authentically, or not of New Mexico, of Nevada, of course, state of Nevada. I love in this established 1979, usually establishments put up, like they wanted the date to be very old, to show that this is a long-standing institution, this is 1979 at this stage is probably 2-3 years before the photograph is taken, so it's like it's boasting of its modernity, and this is very interesting. But again, the form of modernity is this sort of imagined America, and I love the horses outside just really add to that. It's a wonderful image, I think.
So I did a show of some of the abandoned Morris miners. So when we arrived in Ireland, we drove across in our 1953 split screen, refurbished and done up Morris minor. And I couldn't believe the fact that as we were driving around the west of Ireland, you would see all these Morris miners that had been abandoned and just left in the roadside or turned into chicken huts. So I got sort of quite infatuated by these and worked on this series of Morris Minor pictures, which was called Abandoned Morris Minors of the West of Ireland. And in fact, it actually started at the Galway Arts Festival and then came on to Hebden Bridge, which is where I was living before. And we managed to find one of these tremendously old-fashioned printers who did this sort of block type of printing to produce this genuine, old-looking poster. And I think we'll see now some of these Morris Minors. But I couldn't believe that there were so many Morris Minors here. There's more Morris Minors than VWs. So it became an obsession. I would screech to a halt on seeing a Morris Minor and get out and photograph it.
I mean, again, these images are very funny, you know, like this, they're a great comic aspect to them. But they also have that kind of slightly Gothic quality, don't they? Of this sort of, you know, what I love is this is a kind of a very brilliant take on the Gothic tradition of ruins, you know, the ruins in the landscape. And usually it's supposed to be sort of ancient castles or something, but these Morris Minors take the place of the ruins. But there is also this, again, this sort of sense of abandonment, you know, this sense of things that have been, it's a theme in this work, isn't it, Martin? You have the, you know, the abandoned old houses. You know, you have the abandoned Morris Minors, you know, this, so it's a sense of a society which is kind of trying to get rid of its past in a way, but doesn't even sort of bury it. It's just sort of left there, you know, and the new thing will come on top of it or beside it.
In the last 10 years, you know, when being in Ireland, you don't see cars rotting by the side of the road now. I don't know whether these cars just completely rotted away or whether someone took them away or what actually happened to them. But, you know, you don't sort of dump your old car on the bog anymore.
No.
I guess now they've got a sophisticated, you know, car breaker who will take them.
Yeah, people would sell them off, yeah. And here you're moving to colour. Now
we move to colour. So when I came back from Ireland in late 82, I ended up living in Liverpool, or just on opposite side of the ferry to Liverpool in Wallasey. And it's at that point that I started shooting in colour. I'd been thinking about colour before that. And really, after that, doing The Last Resort, which I did in the mid to early 80s, which really sort of helped me, if you like, launch my career beyond the UK. When I came back to Ireland then, I would be shooting in colour automatically. And this is in Dublin. It's one of those markets on Saturday.
I mean, it has a certain sense of grimness about it, doesn't it? I mean, even though it's coming into color, you know, it's, I suppose, socially just worth remembering that the 1980s was really horrific in Ireland. You know, it really was a terrible time because the promise of modernity, you know, had actually collapsed. You know, so 1979, second oil crisis really hit Ireland very, very hard. The long-term consequences of joining the European Union, you know, which was that a lot of Irish industry wasn't competitive. So particularly urban Ireland was really suffering mass unemployment. Mass emigration starts up again. So one of the images people will remember from this time is the queues of people at the American embassy looking for visas to get out. And the urban working class in particular suffered appallingly because a lot of the traditional jobs, you know, were just gone. And that sense of marginalization and of, you know, of people whose way of life is collapsing around them, I think was very, very powerful. And you somehow get it. I think the poignant thing of this, I mean, I know these people are probably just buying the dog food to feed their dogs, but it just, because of the eagerness to buy cheap dog food, it just has something about it which captures that in a particularly poignant way, I think.
But would you say joining the EU was a benefit to Ireland, or would you say it was an issue?
Well, so initially it was probably a great benefit because it was particularly in the countryside, you know, which we've seen in a lot of those photographs, you know, where farm prices were, you know, rising very rapidly, and then they kind of leveled off. But if you were sort of working class Dublin, you know, like where I grew up, there were lots of little industries around, you know, sewing factories and small engineering plants and things like that. And dockers, my father's family were dockers, you know, all those jobs were wiped out because they had been protected, as under the old system, and suddenly they weren't competitive anymore with European markets, and so there was this mass unemployment and a great sense of despair actually around that.
So this is when they did a project, it was called a week in the life of Ireland, and it's one of these projects where they invite photographers to come to Ireland to take pictures. I was invited back for this, and I elected to do supermarkets in Dublin, knowing full well that no one else would be interested in this as a topic whatsoever. They all went over to the west of Ireland, chasing the horse fairs, chasing the idealistic, sort of romantic view of Ireland. And I settled down and did photographs of Super Quinn and various other supermarkets in Dublin, of which this is one. And this is therefore, I think, in the late 80s, sort of 87, 88.
Yeah.
And this is Super Quinn. I think Super Quinn's no longer going, is it?
It's now Super Value. Yeah, it was taken over, but it was very important.
You actually get served by a young man, and the umbrella's carried out to keep you dry to load up the car.
Yes, Fergal Quinn had there were a couple of people actually who were very influenced by American retail, again, and realizing you could do this in Ireland, and Fergal Quinn was one of them. Ben Dunn was the other one, it's hard to remember how exotic a lot of this stuff. I'm sure it was the same in England, Martin, for working class people, but things like aubergines or courgettes, or they just simply were not part of people's experiences, and the Super Quinn in Blackrock, I think, was famous for a certain kind of chicken that they had. I don't know, it was like some kind of prepared chicken, but people used to go for miles, to get this exotic prepared chicken, So, but it was actually very exciting for people. It was actually opening up taste buds and people's sense of what they could afford, assuming they could afford it. But there is also, as well as the kind of despair of people who are being marginalized, there is also a kind of rising middle class, which has new kinds of expectations as well.
But at the time, this must have been one of the sort of most exclusive supermarkets. But if it's called Super Value now, it doesn't sound as if it's kept up that momentum.
No, well, they're all, so you can get whatever you want in Aldi and Lidl, and so the whole palette has changed. The whole idea of what you can eat, what you can afford. These places have made it very cheap. But Blackrock was, so even within this Super Quinn chain, Blackrock was the sort of creme de la creme. It was because the area was, it was the upper middle class area. So definitely the stuff was a bit more expensive.
And here's the new developments. And it's interesting that they've got English names to give it that sort of a degree of authority. And I suppose, what do you think, Fintan? I mean, you name it's
very ironic, isn't it? I mean, this is, you remember the troubles that's going on, the IRA campaigns, everything is going, and but it's fascinating because it's this society which is sort of like grasping for some image of itself. It doesn't really know itself very well, and it's trying to find how can you be modern and Irish, because these things hadn't gone together. It was very much about Catholicism and about this, valorization of an idea that the real Irish person lived in a thatched cottage and, wore tweed underwear and, all that. And then you had this kind of modernity, and what images could you have of it? And I think this is what's fascinating about what you're doing, Martin, because it's literally the image, how are people visualizing their own world? And so the American stuff in rural Ireland, is very, very strong. And then in sort of parts of middle class Dublin or whatever, or maybe middle class Cork, there's a sort of English, maybe that's what we want to be, or that's what we aspire towards. Very uncertain, and raw in a way in terms of trying to understand its own place in the world.
Similar idea here, looking through the show house. So I went to all these show houses in that same week I was doing the supermarkets. And this is the first drive-in McDonald's in Ireland. And of course, the guy hadn't quite twigged that he didn't need to actually get out of the car to order.
It sort of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? but again, it's a very funny image, but it also, it does capture that thing of what's happening here. You know, what kind of world are we entering? How does this thing work? You know, and people trying to come to terms with all of this change and find something that makes sense to them. You know, and of course, the point about an image like this is that, you know, within a couple of weeks, like, nobody would have done this. You know, they would have kept on very quickly. But you capture this moment. Yeah. It's exactly at the moment where something new is there and people are trying to figure it out.
This is Mosney, Butlins Mosney, and I went there during the marching week, which is when a lot of Catholics would try and escape the north. And one of the places they went up to was Butlins Mosney.
This is one of my absolute favorite images of all. You know, I mean, it's very, very funny again, but it just captures something absolutely perfectly. You know? When the Pope, you know, to go back to the Pope, but, you know, in his big address in Phoenix Park, I mean, he talked about temptation. You know, so it was all this imagery that he was using about how Ireland was sort of pure. You know, it was this sort of bastion of a certain kind of traditional Catholicism. And the Irish people were going to be tempted by Satan, you know, towards modernity, consumerism, the pleasures of the flesh. And here you have, in vibrant color, you know, just the fact that the book is called Temptation, and you've got this sort of this couple, you know, I think it's called Like a Lover. So, yeah, you know. It speaks for itself as an image. It really doesn't need to be unpacked too much more. But it's again, it's a kind of absolutely perfect image of what's going on, because she's perfectly happy to be tempted, I think.
And I do love to see these huge cones outside supermarkets and shops. So I did a sort of survey of cones. And by this time, I'm coming in using a macro lens because during my my career, I've had different phases, and this is when I started to come very close. And I applied this to Ireland as well, having previously used the medium format color camera, and so it gave me a chance, if you like, to to actually explore Irish cliches and to actually try and pin them down and to photograph them, such as the ginger hair here with the kid. And the priest. This is four-way races. This is in Stormont. This is, I did a whole project for Belfast Exposed about looking at the tourism industry in the north. And one of the things I went on was the bus trip, which took you around Belfast. And this is a woman looking down at Stormont.
And of course, the weird thing here was that, you know, I mean, Belfast, Northern Ireland is now actually, well, up to the pandemic, you know, was a really thriving kind of tourist spot. But the idea in the 1990s, you know, that somebody would go on their holidays to Northern Ireland, you know, certainly at the beginning of the 1990s was weird. And there was this kind of overlap, you know, where, you know, by the last few years, it was all about Game of Thrones. You know, in the 1990s, it was still sort of that edgy thing about, you know, almost kind of making a spectacle of its own troubles. So a lot of the stuff, you could do these tours, these troubles tours, couldn't you? And you know, it's a very odd phenomenon. You know, it's because you wonder, like, who decides? I'd really love to do a tour of all the places where people were killed, or where there were riots, or, you know, where something awful happened. You know. But that kind of troubles tourism was definitely real. There's still an element of it, but yeah, it's. Do
you think that's been quashed now with the recent riots they've had in Belfast?
Well, it's hard to tell, I suppose, because, you know, the tourism closed down anyway with COVID. But I mean, certainly the big driver of tourism in Northern Ireland in recent years. Well, there've been two things. One is the Titanic Centre, which is actually wonderful, but it's sort of odd, you know, that you one of your main tourist attractions is about a huge disaster. And the other, I said, was Game of Thrones. So the number of people going to see the locations where Game of Thrones was filmed or whatever, it was absolutely huge. So a bit surreal still, I think. Northern Ireland's very beautiful. There's a lot of absolutely fantastic places in it, and the cities are great places to visit in and of themselves. But it's very hard to tell whether this has kind of settled down into a sort of normal tourist spectacle, or whether there's still this element of danger that people actually are almost attracted to.
Oh. Very sorry, what's happened here? Okay. This is on the 12th. This is the marches in Belfast. Likewise, this is on the 12th.
Interesting about this photograph, it's just a general comment, but one of the strange things that's happened over the last 10 years, well, I suppose gradually over 20 years, but particularly over the last 10 years, is that there's now only one place in the United Kingdom where a plurality of people identify as British, and that's Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. So most English people now say they're English, most Scottish people say they're Scottish first, as a first option. Welsh people say Welsh, but there's it's not a majority, but a plurality of people in Northern. The biggest number still says British, and this is a fabulous. I mean, these images are just great because you look at the Union Jack stands out, but then the man is actually wearing trousers which seem to be the flag of St. George, which is the English flag. Mm-hmm. And then the t-shirts are obviously King Billy, which you simply wouldn't see in England. These images wouldn't mean very much to most British people. Yeah. And the orange, they're like a gallery in themselves of contradictions and tensions around what does it mean to be British in Northern Ireland.
Here's the Bobby Sands mural. And these are Americans come to pay their respect.
Yeah.
This is bonfire on the midnight of the 11th.
I mean, it's a sort of photograph you could never resist, could you? I mean, it's just the combination of the.
Oh dear, yeah, you can't.
The text, particularly since it looks like you have to kind of look at it quite hard to see that the building isn't on fire. It actually looks when you look at it first, you think, oh god, this building's burning down. It's like the towering inferno. It's the bonfire in front, but. Celebrate with us is it's sort of interesting politically though, Mark, because there is a serious point of say the Orange Order is sort of trying to say no, what we do is not sectarian, it shouldn't be seen as hateful, it's a spectacle, it's a cultural spectacle, cultural festival, and it's easy to mock, but actually maybe it is one way of people trying to make some sense of stuff that's there and that is problematic, and maybe trying to redefine it in a contemporary way as having a different kind of meaning, something that you can actually enjoy. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but one shouldn't dismiss the intention.
This is in Dublin. Betting and translation services. So last year not last year, the year before that, 2019, I went back to Dublin and photographed, if you like, the sort of modern Ireland as represented here with this this march for, I think it was Extinction Rebellion or something like that, but it was definitely a march on behalf of the environment. And I went to photograph different offices, different sort of new tech companies, up and coming sort of design groups. And this is the front desk of one of these. And this is the now, you know, forget the Morris Minor. This is what you in the centre of Dublin on an electric scooter.
Yeah.
This is the director of a design group, very successful one. I assume all these people have ridden out the COVID disaster and are back up and running again. This is another design group, and this is the woman holding her balloon. She just joined that week, so she's given her I'm new balloon to indicate that everyone's got to come up and say hello and be friendly towards her. And of course, one of the things that you do at these design groups and these tech companies, you have meetings. Is that back in the day, you actually had a room with the same people in. Now it's all done by Zoom, but they've still got their computers out.
Yeah.
And of course, the modern coffee shop. You know, in a sense, I decided on the flat white to be, if you like, the symbol of gentrification, hence the title. And this is where you'd get your flat white from. And as you all know, in this year, just previously, a few months earlier, they'd introduced the ability for gay people to marry in Ireland, which is quite staggering to me. I look back to the days in the early 80s, and if you'd have told me that A, you know, you have a gay Taoiseach, and B, you'd actually have, you know, gay marriage, I just said, this is outrageous. This could never happen. So I was very lucky, and I was able to find a gay wedding, which I attended and photographed with Barbara and Maeve. And here they are. So that became, if you like, the last picture in the book. And I thought it was a good way of ending, apart from the flat white.
I think it's a wonderful way to end. You know, I think what's wonderful about the exhibition, I think, you know, I know people have responded to it very, very warmly in Dublin. People have seen it, you know, or elsewhere. Is, you know, it encapsulates a process of change that's actually it's very difficult to do. I've been trying to write about it, you know, myself and in a book, you know, but it's not that anything that happens here is unprecedented or unique. You know, all of these things have happened to people around the world. You know, it's what happens with modernity. You know, you go from this kind of largely rural agricultural society to urban modernity, and then there's this kind of hyper globalized modernity. But it's just what's happened, and it's happened in such a truncated way. You know, it hasn't happened over 100 years. You know, it's happened over 50, but accelerating as it's gone on. You know, I was looking. You know, when I was born, one of the four, I was looking at, you know, what were the top exports and imports in the Irish economy when I was born, and featuring on both sides were horses going to horse races in England and coming back. So the economy was so terrible that horses going to run in Aintree or whatever were, you know, right, featured in the top 5 Irish exports.
Wow.
And then they featured again in the top 5 imports when they came back. You know? It was like, so, you know, it was such an underdeveloped economy, really, you know, and then, you know, as you capture so well with those wonderful images of the Pope's visits, you know, that this absolute dominance by the Catholic Church, and reinforced in the 80s, you know, so you had the abortion referendum, you know, you had, remember, divorce was defeated, you know, the idea of actually just introducing a very conservative divorce law was defeated by popular vote in 1986, you know, by 2/3 of majority. It wasn't even like close. I mean, it was a very, very, very self-consciously anomalous kind of society where, you know, wanted to hold out against this tide of modernity. But you can't stop the tide, you know, and I think what you see in these photographs so beautifully is the kind of tide coming in, you know. And it's like everything else, you know, it's ambivalent, There's a certain, I don't know about you, Martin, I can't avoid a certain kind of nostalgia looking at some of the earlier photographs, even though I didn't really like that, we wanted to get away from it. But there is something kind of...
That had an innocence and a charm to it, didn't it?
Yeah. And now Ireland is, it's not just globalized, but it's one of the 3 or 4 most globalized economies in the world. 17% of people living in Ireland were born elsewhere, which is fantastic.
17%. Wow, that's high, isn't it? Yeah.
But also 17% of Irish people born in Ireland live elsewhere. So Irish people still emigrate, but it's been matched by inward migration as well. So it's a society which has changed so rapidly. But it also, that makes it hard to get a kind of fix on it, just there's still this sense of who are we? What do we want to keep about the past? What are we glad we've ditched? Do we just want to be the same as everybody else? Because some of those, like some of the early images could not have been taken anywhere else at that time. And some of the late images could have been taken in so many other places, couldn't they? The flat white is a universal symbol of gentrification. And is that what we want? Or do we still want to feel that we're a kind of distinctive sort of place? And I think the wonderful thing about photographs, and about these photographs in particular, is that they sort of ask those questions in the most open-ended way. They allow people to respond to the images in whatever ways they wish, without being told what to think about them. But having this, they do take you on a journey, and make you ask about, is this the end of this journey, or is there somewhere else for it to go, and if so, where?
Good. I think that's the end of the images. So have we got any questions lining up, Tanya? And
yes, we do.
We do indeed. And Trish, you'd lined up there now.
Yeah, we have a question here from Paul O'Giver. If that's pronounced right. Could Martin say something about his transition from black and white to color? And Martin, are you ever going to use black and white again?
The transformation happened in the early 80s. I'd become aware of the fact that you could take a serious photograph in color with people like Ayleston, Stephen Shaw, getting museum shows in America. So this encouraged me. And then one of the things I'd been collecting were John Hine postcards, which, if you recall, of course, he had his company in Ireland, were very brightly colored. And, I just liked the appeal of that. And basically, they also introduced this 6x7 camera called a plough bell, which was a medium format camera. So some of the other photographers I knew in Britain had bought these, and I went out and bought one. And once I started shooting it, when I did the New Brighton, seaside pictures called The Last Resort, I never wanted to shoot black and white again. So the answer is to the second part of the question. I will never go back to black and white. So the sort of the shift, if you like, happened in like 83, 82, immediately after Ireland. And since then, I've been shooting color.
Okay. Could I ask then also, it's a question from Brendan O'Shea. Do you find that project-based photography for you came more from purposefully wanting to set out and shoot certain themes, or from seeing themes emerge organically in photographs you had already shot and seeing potential for projects from that point?
It's a bit of both, really. I mean, sometimes I'm working on a specific project, so for example, when I came to Dublin and photographed there, I knew I wanted to have the sort of final chapter of the Irish book. And sometimes you get commissioned, you get invited and you get paid a fee to do a particular project about a particular town or place or a country. And then the other time I'm sort of building up, an archive of pictures, because my basic project is photographing the leisure pursuits of people of the wealthy West. So at any given time, I can add pictures to this archive, and then later on down the road, I can take pictures out and do a particular project about one of these topics. So yes, it's you're doing work for yourself, you're doing occasionally commissioned work, and all this go into this sort of big archive, if you like. And if someone said to me, can I do a book about dogs? I'd have no trouble going to my archive, putting in keyword dogs, and I'd have 500 pictures to select a project from, for example.
Great.
Okay, question here for Fintan. Do you think the idea that Irish culture is not visual is still valid if it ever was valid?
Not visual.
Not
For
visual.
Fintan, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
question for Fintan. But you can answer too, Martin, if you want to.
It never really made a lot of, it said a lot, and of course it's definitely true that in terms of the cultural hierarchy, there was probably for good reasons, if you've got James Joyce and Butler Yeats and John Synge and Ed O'Brien and, Sally Rooney, it does,
but John Synge was a photographer.
It kind of, yes, indeed. Well, so exactly. So Synge was a photographer. Bernard Shaw was a photographer.
Yep.
The huge interest in visualization, even within the writing itself. And of course, theatre, which is a very visual form. People sense of, theatre is not just people talking. It's stuff that you're looking at and things going on. So I think it's an oversimplification, to suggest that art wasn't a visual.
Was it more about means, do you think? I think
exactly. It was about means. It's about poverty to a large extent. Relatively few people had access to the kind of the creative materials to be able to do this. And that's one of the great things that's happened more recently is, that the materials are very accessible. People find a way with the technologies of making visual art if they want. But I do think what was true, and I think what's fascinating though, looking at Martin's photographs, is that we had a terrible sense of design. There was no public design culture, or very little of it. And oddly enough, that itself is very visually interesting in retrospect. Looking at huge ice cream cones outside shops at the time looked just hideous, and now it looks very interesting. It looks like, wow, it's like, some kind of ancient cult that, archaeologists have discovered, this kind of ice cream god.
Well, in November, we're hoping to explore this in detail when we're doing our first survey of the history of Irish photography. So we're going to be revealing lots of hidden gems that will build a canon of Irish photography. I think we have another question there, Tanya, have we?
Yes, indeed. Question for Martin from Saoirse. What didn't you photograph, or what couldn't you photograph? What are the gaps?
Oh, there's a huge number of gaps. I mean, this is not meant to be a thorough sort of look at Irish society, because there's so many things I didn't photograph, so many things I could have photographed. I mean, I didn't really get into the upper echelons of Irish society. I didn't do the Dublin snob, if you like. That would have been interesting to have tapped into. It's mainly to do with where I was, and what sort of contacts I had and what I could get to. So it's never meant to be, particularly thorough. It's just what I bumped into in my time in Ireland, which with the benefit of hindsight, all sort of came together as a sort of story in itself. But, I spent a lot of time fretting about what I didn't do. But, you can't do everything in life.
No. Here's another question for Martin. In a globalized world where individual culture gets subsumed, is it harder to make interesting photographs?
No, not really. I think, the challenge of trying to create an interesting photograph will always be there. I think a good photo has some kind of story, some kind of edge, some kind of ambiguity, some kind of contradiction. I mean, that's what I'm aiming at myself. And you never quite know when or how that's going to come up. And often it's easier to judge it after the event rather than during. Mm. So, but you have to just keep shooting, really. You have to just keep going at it. And then suddenly things will fall into place. If you're going to an event, you have to work out where people reveal themselves, where their good backgrounds are, things like this. So I think it's just as easy now to take a good photo. But when we look back with the benefit of nostalgia on the 60s, I often see to myself, God, look at those clothes that people were wearing in the 1960s. But we'll be doing the same, of course, in 30 years' time, looking back on this decade.
Indeed. And a question here from John for Fintan. Has your view of the work, of Martin's work, changed since you wrote about it for A Fair Day?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Yes, I think because, the passage of time. Martin mentioned the word nostalgia. So at the time, I was present with Martin when he took some of these photographs. I certainly, he had a lot of the archive, but he asked me to do the text, and then he at Mam Cross, for example, and in certainly one of the ballrooms, I actually went with him. By the way, he's talking about how you can just.
Did you score?
No, total failure. Even at the horse fair, I couldn't even get a horse. But it's worth saying to people who, I know there are professional photographers here and they know this, but it was how hard the photographer works. I was absolutely shocked. I'd never been up at 5:30 in the morning ever before. I just the concept of 5:30 in the morning did not exist in my life. And this fecker getting me up, saying we're going to the horse fair, and I said, but it's not going to start for hours. Like, that's the point. So I never watched an artist like this at work. Where he's the first thing people see when they arrive at Mam Cross is feckin' Martin Parr. He's there, this tall Englishman, with a camera.
With the red jumper?
I don't think he was wearing the red jumper, but he was pretty prominent anyway, And of course, it's brilliant because the initial reaction is, who's this fecker? Why is he taking these photographs? And then, he's there, but he's there for the entire day. He's like 12 hours working. And that's where you get those fantastic photographs, right? Which is people who've become used to him, and are no longer remarking on the fact that he's there. So I was much more conscious of the process, I think, when I was writing about the photographs and some kind of context on them for the original book. And it all seemed oddly, and this this world was as strange to me as it was to Martin, possibly even more so, because he'd lived there. I was a Dublin kid, I really didn't know dance halls. I didn't really know horse fairs, So for me, it was sort of odd, and it was sort of, I looked at that work very much as a kind of realistic thing of capturing certain things. And I suppose now there's a kind of a double distance. There's the distance of actually looking at them much more as works of art, because you're a little bit more removed from the process and from the time. But also there is, and I find myself fighting against this, but not being able to entirely get rid of it. There is that nostalgic thing, this glow of, wasn't it such an interesting world visually? Is it a more interesting world or a less interesting world? You can argue about that, but it is. I mean, I happen to absolutely love the black and white images that Martin made. They're incredibly beautiful as images, and you see the original photographs, and they're actually wonderfully printed in this book as well. So you get a real sense of the depth.
They have huge heart.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, I have a question here from Circa Ryder. She's a recent graduate and she's taken much inspiration and fascination with your work. Can you speak a little about the relevance of food and class in your photos?
Well, I guess there are two topics that have been brought into my vocabulary, if you like. I mean, I've done a lot of pictures of food, and the best food pictures are usually the cheap food. So junk food makes better pictures than posh food, because you often see posh food depicted in magazines, so we're sort of we're more familiar with that. Whereas you don't often see beans on toast or a plate of greasy chips in a magazine. So it's a shock when you actually see that. And class, if you're British, you can't avoid class, because it's we're a very class-dominated society. And over my time, I'm classic middle class. I've photographed the working class, the middle classes, and the upper classes. So in terms of being a very democratic photographer, I've gone and looked at all the different classes in Britain, but I'm very acutely aware of that when I'm out photographing, which class that I'm sort of dealing with, if you like.
Okay. That Circa, by the way, her grandfather sold at Cumberland Street, Parnella, for years.
Yeah.
We saw that. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm able to. Am I able to speak in this? I don't know. I just wanted.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you saw that comment, but it was actually one of the things that struck me. I only went to see the show the other day. I finally got the chance, and it was how intimately you captured Ireland, because this was something that I've heard about my whole life. Like, I remember my granddad, he sold some of my stuff, like it was called Parneller on Cumberland Street, and then I saw the photo and I was like, that's that place that my mom always talks about, that he always was kind of known for, and he was a real character down there. So I wasn't expecting, you know, how personal the photos were to like Irish life, you know, the things that maybe aren't as broadly known. So yeah, that was one of the things that really struck me about the show. And
do I assume Cumberland Street is no longer operating as a market?
I don't know. I don't know if it was even fully legal, some of the stuff though. I'm not really sure. I don't think it still goes on, but yeah, even in my childhood, yeah, he was still selling everything and anything there.
Right.
Another question here, Martin. Can you speak about the role of humour in your work, which is a tricky question?
Well, I suppose, you know, I mean, when you look at the world that we live in, it is quite a funny place. So I always think, you know, how could you not make photographs about the world today without having humour in it? And also it saves us from having to cry, if you like. So, you know, I think, you know, I think humour, but, you know, I don't sort of go around thinking, oh, I'm a very humorous photographer, but just by observing what you see, you know, humour comes into it, because we are funny. People are funny.
Yeah. There's a question here then, the slightly related question from Claire. Photography is an inherently voyeuristic medium. Is it increasingly difficult to make images in the public realm as the public become very sensitized to how they're portrayed?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably more difficult now to photograph in a street than it was, say, 30 years ago. I mean, certainly in the black and white days in Ireland, you know, I mean, people might just ask what you're doing. You might be chatting to people, but you certainly wouldn't have someone come up to you and say, you know, you have no right to take my photograph. People do this now, especially middle-class people. You know, they're the worst, if you like, for that sort of reaction. So yeah, I'd say generally speaking, it's going to get more difficult. And I imagine, you know, sooner or later, there may be laws where people will not be allowed to photograph on the street. But as it stands now, you can do that. And certainly in the UK, you can photograph anywhere you like in a public place and do anything you like with it. I don't know what the law is in Ireland, whether it's...
People think you can't, you can, but people often, photographers are often accosted by people telling them that they can't. It's
exactly,
it's kind of interesting, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think another question there.
I'm being told that Seamus Grogan has his hand up, but I actually can't locate him on my little screens here to ask him what he wants to add.
Hi guys, sorry I didn't realise my hand was up, but yeah, I have a question. Thanks to Tanya and thank you to Trish from the Gallery of Photography for organising this event. And
Seamus.
Hiya Trish, and hi to Martin and to Fintan. Martin, I'm from a little village in North Leitrim called Drumcairn that you might remember.
Yeah. Stuck
between Drumshambo, the Mayflower Ballroom of Romance, and Manor Hamilton, where a lot of those images are taken. And I'm just curious, you mentioned earlier in the talk about the circuit of photographers in the 70s. And I mean, for example, in Drumcairn, I was photographed by Jill Friedman with my father in, I think in the early 70s, 73, 74. And she came back a number of times as well. I'm just wondering why photographers took a certain route, or was it just mostly sporadic? But both yourself and perhaps Jill Friedman come into the same environment. And also the second part of the question would be about for example, a Fair Day was sort of looking at the change that had happened in society at that point with the abandoned Morris miners and rituals and holy wells and stuff. And I'm currently researching an MA in creative practice in IT Sligo. So I've gone back and looked at a lot of the locations in North Leitrim, which is mostly forested now and kind of resembles the Amazon jungle. The communities and the people and the events that you photographed are long gone. And mostly environments are sparsely populated, mostly by trees. And I'm just curious, is it an evolving thing? If we did the same thing now, would we say we have evolved from this? But I suppose it continues indefinitely.
I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is, we went to all these events where there was horse fairs and Patrick, because they're very visual. It's
Sure.
It's a great place to photograph. Horses and farmers and old farmers in particular are very photogenic. So it meant that you could actually spend a day there and come back with something. So that's why we all were attracted to it. And as Fintan pointed out, it is, they genuinely did events. They genuinely were happening, these events. So it's a sort of a fair crop, if you like. But what I try to do, even though I was sucked into that sort of aspect of it, is to look beyond that as well, a different aspect of Irish life. But you can see why people do that. And of course, it has changed. I don't know about the forestation of Leitrim, but I'm surprised that some of those venues would have disappeared entirely.
No, they wouldn't have. They're not disappeared. For example, the Mayflower Ballroom is, I believe, a community centre at the moment, but a lot of them would have gone through transitions depending on what happened in the community. So, and also the Ballroom of Romance, Glenfarne, I think perhaps maybe a community centre as well. But
well, good. I'm glad they're still standing.
Oh, they're still, yeah, absolutely, yeah. But I do remember that they were sort of, especially the Ballroom of Romance was. It was kind of controlled by a mix of maybe a religious influence, like the priest would be standing at the door, kind of acting as a bouncer if you sort of misbehaved inside,
Yeah.
And as you said, the rituals.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Seamus. There, if I could just butt into, we are kind of coming up to time here, and I think we have time for a final question. Brian Sparks has asked, can you speak about any other photographers or particular photographs from Ireland that you admire and that have particularly inspired you? So we've just said how generous you are to other photographers, so no pressure there, Mark.
Well, one of the members of this touring circuit was Tony Murray, who's a very good photographer, and he's just had a book out, I think last year, which is very good.
Holy Pictures, yes, yes, fantastic book.
And I mean, you've got your stars like Tony O'Shea and everybody. And
who is here in this room?
Yeah, and we've just received the Gilles book. I mean, this is a remarkable document. The if you say nothing, say nothing at all. What's it called? No, I've got that wrong.
Whatever you say nothing.
Whatever you say nothing at all. Anyway, that's a remarkable book. I mean, that's going to take some beating. That's I think it's sort of 1,600 pages, 2 books, and it's a remarkable document. It took him 25 years to shoot it. It's, in a sense, it's going to be the king of all books about Ireland.
Well, not so fast, Martin, because I would like to say that really, we have been very, really pleased to have your show here, but also that it is something we were asking about the role of humor and so on. It is something that when you make work that has a lighter touch, it can often be dismissed as being sort of, not weighty and not important or whatever. But it reaches, I can tell you, your work has reached people's hearts. And in a way that is testament enough. So with that, I just would love to thank you very much, both Fintan, Martin, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for taking part in this evening's conversation. We will be putting it out as a recording, and so you can relive your moments. And we hope very much that you'll come to see the exhibition. It's on until the Saturday, the 4th of September. Followed by the Pre-Pictet exhibition, which is also a huge, a must-see for everybody. So with that, though, I would thank you all very much, and I wish you a very good night.
Great. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.